Alright, hi, my name is Maya Telez, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a crisis in our government. Some of you might be thinking, which one? So today, Fox News recently released statistics that said 70% of Americans disapprove of Congress. It's pretty well known that right now, if you pay attention at all to our media, that our population is really upset with our Congress. It's really inefficient and it's disconnected. So today, my proposition is that in the last 35 years, the two-party system has created a competitive environment that inhibits collaboration necessary in Congress. In order to prove this proposition, I'm first going to explain to you some vocabulary, what is a two-party system and how it functions. Then I'm going to describe the political environment that a two-party system creates. And lastly, I'm going to explain to you why I think it's dangerous and corrupting. So to my first point, the two-party system is basically a democratic system where two parties get the majority of the votes and positions in government. So it's pretty common knowledge that in our society, we have Democrats and Republicans. They really do receive the majority of the votes and they have the majority of the positions. And this, I believe, as I've stated in my claim, results in polarization. And that is really what is creating this clash that is inhibiting our Congress, polarization. Polarization is essentially when you have two values and they're going head to head, and as they go head to head, they push each other apart. So as you know, there is clash. Instead of sort of being a unifying Congress, we're simply dividing ourselves. All right, so now heading to my second point. Basically to prepare for this, I read a book. It's called Winner Takes All. It's written by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, and they both write a lot on politics. And they talk about sort of this shift. Why has polarization in Congress happened? And they basically attribute it to a cultural change, a change in the way that politicians look at politics and strategize. And really what has happened is what they call prerequisites for running for Congress. So basically, Congress has created this culture of conformity. You know, if you want to run for Congress, if you want a position in politics, you need to agree with us. You can really see that in campaigns. It's been changed drastically from sort of, here are my ideas, to I'm running against you because you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. And the result is actually what's going to take me to my third point. But Hacker and Pearson call it taking hostage. And it's when they say, if you don't agree with me, too bad, I'm not going to compromise. So my last point is polarization is bad. So we can see that polarization, just looking at through this book that I read, that polarization is extremely, it's happening. But so why is this bad? Why is this inhibiting our Congress from working? And it's going back to this taking hostage strategy. So basically, Congress has, now compromise is bad. And I have a quote from Speaker of the House, John Boehner. He says, I've made it clear I'm not going to compromise on my principles, nor am I going to compromise on the will of the American people. And essentially what he said, it was an interview, and essentially what he said throughout the interview was this idea that compromise is bad. And that, we're willing to not move any legislation forward if that means my ideas. It's the ideals of the party over the ideals of the bettering of our country as a whole. And just an example of that was when in 2013 our government shut down for 16 days, which is actually one of the highest, and shut down for 16 days over budget because we couldn't decide on a budget, and that obviously had a really big effect on our society. So to conclude, basically, I believe that the two-party system encourages an us versus them. Throughout the years, politicians have recently started to form norms in which, like, politicians have to conform to their party's norms. If politicians can't pass laws to reform or pass new laws or reform old laws, we can't improve our country. As long as we only have two parties going to head in Congress, the environment will be one of stagnation. So, thank you.
All right, I think the proposition at the beginning is a little convoluted. You've got like an extra justification built in at the beginning, but ultimately you do identify something that is a claim of fact, so I think you're okay, just need to clean it up a little bit. There's a solid layout of what the secondary structures are going to be, and that kind of helps explain what that argument is in the first place, so that helps you, but I don't think that that's a substitute for having a much more definitive proposition. The secondary issues were labeled, but they aren't always labeled as declarative sentences. It sounds to me like you were giving us explanations. I did think on the third point you had a pretty declarative statement on that particular point, but the first 2 points, they sound like an explanation of a theory much more than they sound like an inference about what's happening. I like the idea of your being inspired by the book, but I do think sometimes it sounds like we're getting a book report on their theory rather than an argument that they've got it right. So you got to be careful about that. You're going to have to look for additional information that illustrates those points. I suspect that they probably had some of those examples in the text of the book, and you needed to cite some of those kinds of things. So intransigence over reform of the tax code, problems, like you said, you mentioned the one thing about the government shutdown, but what you don't mention is what was behind all of the government shutdown, that there is a vastly different perception of how we ought to be handling debt and what the debt ceiling means and those sorts of things, and that there are issues that are related to that. Some of that may be related to the two-party system, some of it may be related to the way Congress just inherently works, regardless of who the parties are and how they wield control through the procedures that the government uses there. I think that there is probably a good degree of culpability on those sorts of issues. The second point is almost all asserted, and I think that that's another place where it shouldn't be that hard to find some examples or illustrations to support your point. I did think it was a little problematic when you cite the authors of the text that you tend to summarize and paraphrase what they're saying instead of directly quoting them, and you need to be doing that directly, I think. All right, and the rule of norms, it makes it sound like there's something that's different happening now than what once happened, and I'm still a little vague on what that is, because both parties have tended to have an identifiable set of values or belief systems over the years. If there's a reason to believe that they once compromised on their values and beliefs and now they don't compromise on their values and beliefs, why is that a bad thing? Or can you document that that sort of thing is happening? Boehner's quote, for instance, needs to be put in context. I don't know if it was talking about a particular issue, and compromising on your principles, I'm not sure why it's a bad thing to stick to your principles. Now, some things might not be based on principles. For instance, it's you believe something is one way. That's not a principle. I believe that this will work or that it won't work. That's a belief in, an issue of fact or an inference that somebody's making. That's a lot different than saying it's wrong to do this particular kind of thing, which is a principle in which, I think people say, why is it bad to stick to your principles? Otherwise you just change for the purpose of political expediency. You get people saying stuff like, well, they change their positions because the population's point of view has changed, so it's not really a reflection of what they really believe, just what's going to get me elected, that kind of thing.